Hello and welcome to the Sabrina River Folk Podcast with me, Nicola Haasz. Tonight's guest is Brett Hollyhead from the Welsh Marches, the hinterland between England and Wales. Brett has recently published his first book, Sabrina, Discovering the Goddess of the River Severn, on Pagan Portals by Moon Books Publishing, and he joins me tonight to tell us all about it. So, welcome to the podcast, Brett.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute privilege to be on it.
So, as we do, if we could start with a little bit about yourself and where you were born, your history, and where you grew up, please.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Brett, and most people will know me throughout the magical community as the Witch of Salopia. So I'm a Welsh Marches folk witch, and in my personal life, I'm also a professional pole dance instructor, avid crocheter, and I'm just generally an all-round menace, really, to society. I post on TikTok talking about folklore, and from my own personal history, I was born in Shrewsbury, also known as Amwythig, and throughout my whole entire life, I was spent crossing the River Severn, spending my half my life growing up in Powys with my father and in Shropshire with my mother. So I am a proper borderlands child, passed over left, right, and centre more times than a cheese board at a party.
What was that like? Were you aware of that from a very young age, that you were sort of stepping over into from England to Wales? Was that something you were aware of?
Yes and no. It's really strange because I think a lot of people who live within the border or within the Welsh Marches between England and Wales, you're inherently aware of something that is quite liminal and distinct in the landscape as well as within the surroundings. So even though I was born in Shropshire, and I grew up in Wales, I almost felt disingenuous with my identity because I came from a very mixed family background. So half my family were English and half of them were Welsh. So it was always a bit of a difficult task to choose who to support during rugby. Or when I was growing up, of course, so I crossed over the River Severn to spend time with my father in Newydd or Newtown, or sometimes in Arostog with my grandparents. And because they're such borderland territories, back in those days, it was hard to come across people speaking Welsh really because they're so close to the vicinity of the border. You find that the language is less spoken there than places like Ynys Môn or, towards the west more in places like Gwynedd. But the Welsh language did exist there, but unfortunately, because I came from a divorced family background, I didn't have the opportunity to grow up immersed into the Welsh culture as I am today. So I wasn't allowed to go to Welsh school. I grew up in Shropshire, and so I almost felt that I wasn't in place because I'd never identified myself as English. And I think a lot of people who, especially those who come from the Welsh Marches, which includes Cheshire, Herefordshire, Gloucestershire as well, and parts of Worcestershire, I think when you look towards the history of this place from the time of the March of Lordships all the way down to the Celtic Continuum and the early Celtic tribes, this place has always been inherently distinct in its culture and throughout its history. And so to define myself through that, it didn't quite feel right for me to just to label myself and be restricted by the identity of English when I didn't identify that way because I grew up in Wales myself. I had Welsh family and yeah, I grew up speaking a tiny, tiny bit of Welsh, not too much, but unfortunately I had to relearn that all and to really embrace my culture and my ancestral lineage. So yeah, it was aware at the time and one of the major influences, I suppose, in terms of me doing what I do today was trying to reconcile my identity, reconcile that there is something here that is very much overlooked and neglected in terms of the homogenized British identity. And when I found out pieces of information that relate to the Welsh Marches, it kind of just solidified and made sense. And so, yeah, I was very much aware of it, but I didn't do anything about it until later on in life when I had the resources to do so.
It must have been fabulous growing up there with, all those castles and things. Well, as
Oh,
I say, yeah, we'll come on to
honestly,
that.
you can't walk 5 minutes out the door without barging into either a standing stone or some castle. It was almost like growing up like a little princess almost. I was running around frolicking all these castle ruins, pretending to be betrothed to some handsome prince. It was fabulous.
Wonderful. I still frolic as a princess when I can.
Oh, absolutely. It's life goals.
So obviously growing up then between and betwixt, Shropshire and Newtown and Paris, you were obviously very aware of the Severn because
Mm,
if you grow up anywhere near the Severn, it's such a big feature of the landscape. Um, so it becomes part of our psyche. And
yes.
So we grew up with it. But for me, it wasn't until later that I really understood what Sabrina was. But obviously, one of the things we're talking about tonight is the release of your new book. For me, a lovely part of the story was when you had your kind of first real encounter with Sabrina at a park in Shrewsbury. And I just wondered if you could give us some background to it and perhaps read the paragraph from the book for us as well, please.
Yes, of course. Like I'm very much like you. I think those of us who live in close vicinity of the River Severn will always be interwoven with it as part of our identity. It's our central tenant, and it allows us a central marker to come back and return to, especially when we strive too far away from home. And so, yeah, growing up with Sabrina, she was interwoven into my life from a very early age, from her stories being told in childhood. But as you said, I think for me personally, it didn't quite take central hold of me into the importance of its cultural aspects and its history until much later on when I had um, the appreciation of it through further study. But I've had multiple encounters with Sabrina, either from just passing by on the River Severn as a young child, but I didn't truly understand that the River Severn was sacred in such a way until I encountered the Dingle. So in Shrewsbury, there is a place called known as the Dingle, and it's a almost a floating garden that's placed within inside a quarry. So it's a beautiful outlet of land that's right next to the River Severn. It flows right past it. And in this dingle, it is a floral masterpiece. It's surrounded by every type of breed of species of flower that you can come across. And right at the end, there is a statue that was placed there to commemorate Sabrina from the story of Comus, written by John Milton in the 17th century, and she's situated underneath the bridge. And I was only very young at the time. My mum took me out for a day trip into Shrewsbury to go do some shopping. But I remember exploring the dingle and taking it all in. It was almost a overwhelming sensation, sensory overload almost from the beautiful sights and smells. But it was when I came across, so I can vividly remember stopping dead in my tracks and just fixating on this statue. And I know a lot of boys at that age would look at her because she is half naked and they'll be, lusting after her. But for me, it was something visceral. It was something that almost, I don't know, it took me out of the physical landscape itself and took me into this threshold, this periphery that only me and her were in. And I couldn't explain it at the time until later on when I learned about animism and obviously the folklore of the Seven, and it made sense. But yeah, that was my very first encounter with Havren or Sabrina. And yeah, I wrote that in my book as my very first encounter.
Could you read that paragraph for us now?
Of course. The dingle is a floral masterpiece, bursting with colour and fragrance, enticing any who visit Shrewsbury to explore the beauty it holds, a sanctuary of flowers that I eagerly explored. My first visit is one I will never forget. Whilst running along its circling paths, I was stopped in my tracks by a sudden appearance of an astonishing statue, which I had never noticed before. In a rare moment of silence amongst all the excitement, I examined the statue before me, a beguiling woman of stone resting upon her side, lifting her hair and gazing at a reflection in the pool surrounding her. Though she appeared calm and dignified, I was overcome with a feeling of sorrow that hung heavy in the air between us. I asked my mother who she was. This was the goddess Sabrina, she told me. Drowned at an early age and forever bound to the river as its guardian, we had finally met in flesh and stone.
I loved that. And I was in that moment with you, and I really felt that as I read the book. And obviously, that was the first of many, many encounters with Sabrina.
Yes.
But I have been to that statue myself, and you're right, it's beguiling, it's enchanting, and yeah, really a special place. So I can see why that had a profound effect on you at a very early age.
It really did, yeah. And it didn't quite connect the two at the point until later on in school when the teacher would tell me about her stories that it made sense why I felt such impending sadness could overcome me, even though the statue didn't necessarily elicit any sort of sadness to be felt at that point. And of course, anyone that goes to visit that statue will see that there is a marking nearby that shows the invocation of Sabrina from the play that she was written about in. And it's wonderful to see her just shown that there is a statue that people can come and visit and see that has this central garden, this tutelary force that is overlooking one of the towns that she flows through.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, you then, as you grew up, you found yourself on the pagan path,
Yes.
and you became, a witch, and you became aware of the magical life that we lead. And, you've also recounted stories where you went to the banks of Sabrina and made offerings, and on one occasion, two swans came and approached you.
Yes.
That was a really lovely story. So you were really building a really strong relationship with her.
Yes, absolutely. So that encounter came round about my teenage years when I started to delve properly into my witchcraft practice. So
Mm,
I was kind of lucky really because I grew up in a household that I didn't necessarily have any kind of religious doctrine put upon me. I wasn't expected to follow any kind of religious path. I was just a wild child, I suppose. My mother was very spiritual, and so my very first encounter with anything spiritually adjacent was through those Mind, Body, and Spirit magazines. So I kind of grew up knowing what joss sticks were and crystals. Until later on, my mother had a bit of a spiritual breakdown, and we kind of turned to Christianity for a little bit, and she blamed me for practicing witchcraft, killing all her sunflowers. And not that she was a terrible gardener that year, but yeah, blame the witch. But in that time frame, I kind of grew up practicing Wicca. I was very much invested in the tradition as a Wicca, but I didn't necessarily resonate with the cultural aspects that I grew up with, and I could draw inspiration from the landscape I belonged to until it later hit me that there were folk practices I could draw upon. And so, in those practices, I encountered Sabrina as almost this protectress, that she will come and answer and aid those who are oppressed and marginalized that call out to her. And at that time, I was going through quite a turbulent point in my own personal history, and I thought, you know what, let's go to this river, let's call out to her. And it was one of the most beautiful encounters I've ever had in my life, and I didn't necessarily know what to expect. Because I think a lot of times people expect when they go and invocate to a deity, they will often interpret them to be anthropomorphic form, that they'll just come out of the river or out of a tree or out of a mountain and look like a human. But in my very first encounters, that later led on to two swans coming forth, and swans throughout many types of river folklore are very much an animal that are heavily associated with the waterways, that nourishing aspect. And as I was there calling out to Sabrina and envisioning her in my mind and having that almost comforting feeling come over me, I opened my eyes and those two swans, which I still see today in Shrewsbury, one was resting up its head upon my lap near enough, and one was sat next to me. And I absolutely cacked my pants. I won't lie, because you hear these stories of like, oh yeah, don't go near swans. They're capricious. They're territorial. They'll break your arm. But in that moment, it just felt so magical, and I was speechless. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say, but I knew that my call had been answered. And after that point, a lot of things improved in my life. And so from there, I made offerings. I made frequent visits to places because as a child, one of the most common places I would go to see to the Severn would be in Newtown, where I'd go to the riverbank and I'd swim. And even today, I will go and make my own personal pilgrimage to Pimlimmon Fawr, which is where the Severn comes from, and go and swim in the waters of the river there. And it's been a continual practice ever since. I'd be bereft without it.
yeah, and I've said before, there's lots of people that I know that have been healed by Sabrina, have been saved by Sabrina, have been cried tears into Sabrina, and she is there. She is
Absolutely.
there for people as a friend, which sounds strange to talk about a river as a friend, but not to people who understand that we are in kinship with the natural world.
Yes.
And so that's a really lovely story that those swans, put its head on your lap. That's just
Yeah. Oh,
adorable.
thank you. It was, and I love what you said there. I think there is a common tendency, especially within contemporary society, to see rivers as just nothing more than a commodity that we can use. But I think a lot of us who understand and appreciate the natural world, that there is no distinguishment between myself and a river and a tree. We're all equal in every single aspect within this interconnected web of connection between each other. And I think people, even if they don't have to necessarily be a pagan or a witch, but just being by the river and just having that moment of mindfulness, stopping and hearing its ebb and flow, will recognize that there is something sacred there, that it'll plunge at our heartstrings a little bit in the same way that our ancestors did. And it's something I encourage people. Like, you don't necessarily have to see the river as, this magnificent goddess, but just to see it as alive and a vibrant with this flourishing landscape. It's beautiful, and it's really hard to articulate sometimes because it is the language of the heart almost. That's the beauty of water itself as a sacred element. It communicates with the language of the heart.
It does, yeah, absolutely. And I'm fascinated by this idea of this liminal space that you
Mm.
grew up in on the borderlands of the Welsh Marches. Could you possibly just give us some idea of what really the Welsh Marches is?
Yes, so I think people have heard me talk about the Welsh Marches before. I think we'll give a bit of an eye roll as to how many times I talk about it, because I do drill it often enough. But when we talk about the Welsh Marches, we are talking about an ill-defined area that has experienced a huge amount of fluidity and changed in terms of its borders. So we're specifically referring to the eastern territories of Wales and the western territories of England that form a hinterland that can be described as Anglo-Welsh. And it's very much distinct both in terms of its culture and its people and its folklore, but it also has a very historical precedent as well. So if we go back all the way to the ancient Celtic tribes, you'll find that this area is very liminal. There are seasonal migrations and transitions happening in this place that kind of have a different topography almost compared to the rest of England. But the Welsh March itself comes in terminology. It comes from the Norman invasion in 1066, where William the Conqueror invaded the landscape and he came over to Wales. And everyone knows that for any kind of Welsh history book, you'll find that Wales has suffered a huge amount of colonization and invasion from people who tried to subjugate the culture, and the Normans were one of those. But during the Norman invasion, the Marcher Lords were established, in which William the Conqueror established specifically three Marcher Lords, both within Cheshire, Herefordshire, and Shrewsbury. And in that landscape, they had a independent jurisdiction, legality, and economic freedom away from the sovereign crown of England. So we
Mm.
have a historical precedent that extends both from Cheshire all the way down to Gloucestershire, that these lands themselves were not English, but they weren't Welsh either, but they were very much a in-between place that experiences a very distinct culture. And you can see that in terms of the influence of its folklore. And this wasn't later absolved into England up until about the 16th century. And even then, the Council of the Welsh Marches, which was established in Ludlow, didn't disintegrate until about the 1600s, really, 1700s going on. So when people call places like Gloucestershire, England, or Shropshire, England, I always have a little bit of I don't know, a weird, peculiar feeling in me because that completely disseminates this overarching domination in the same way that English culture has done, because it doesn't necessarily highlight those beautiful aspects that are still carrying on today, because the borders still continue to change. Places like Oswestry in Shropshire and even Monmouthshire weren't necessarily situated in the permanent boundaries that we have today until quite recently. And even now, when you look towards certain journal articles or even during the council jurisdictions as well, you'll find that places like the Forest of Dean now arguing to be put under Welsh councils. Or when the River Severn first had its pollutants being brought to public attention, the English government said that places like Shropshire and Hereford were Wales's problem because the River Severn and the River Wye, which are the two main predominant rivers, form and have their basis in Wales. So there almost is that aspect within history that people can ascribe to both England and Wales. And a lot of people within those counties often have a mixed heritage in terms of English and Welsh. A lot of people are born over the border because they don't necessarily have the same places of hospitals or the same kind of infrastructure that people can be born within the place that they're living currently. So it is a very mixed place, both in history, and I think that's one of the fabulous aspects that Sabrina encapsulates as this sovereign ruler of the in-between, a deity that's neither English nor Welsh, but both at the same time in that very paradoxical manner.
Yeah, and I suppose all through that sort of landscape, that Anglo-Welsh border, she is the dominant feature of the landscape, isn't she?
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, those marcher lords had very independent and also very powerful control over those territories, like you
Yes.
say. And so, a lot of history went down there, didn't it? And there's a lot of echoes of that in the folklore and in the mythology of that landscape, which is, as I alluded to earlier, for me, when I go and visit, it's very mystical. It's the stuff of dragons and stories around the castles and,
Mm.
and, and great battles. And obviously, that's a lot of dark history there as well. But when you talk about a liminal space, in that area, can you maybe explain to listeners what a liminal space is?
Yes, so a liminal space can be described as a betwixt and between area that kind of suspends itself from the physicality of your living realm as itself. So usually you can encounter liminal spaces anywhere you are, depending in your day-to-day life, really. So liminal itself is somewhere that's neither here nor there, but in that in-between space where you are shrouded in that otherworldly aspect where everything in life as it is doesn't have influence on you because you are in a direct influence of something that's almost can be described as numinous. This numinous experience where you're encountering almost a divine entity or a divine feeling that both causes this feeling of awe and inspiration, but also terror and fear. So it's almost, in the most simplistic way I can probably put it, it's almost being in an encountering space with something that is other, something that is great, something that suspends our very physical realm itself into something that's very spiritual, encompassing.
And also, I think that a lot of that territory, Brett, is very untouched by technology still. So when you're
Yes.
in those places, um, you do get a sense of the ancientness of that space because a lot of it wasn't developed, in that sense, or modernized in any way. And so you still get a sense of the landscape being exactly how it was, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And so you really feel that the history there is incredibly tangible. And yeah, really, really just wow, the energy is amazing. And to grow up with that and the mythology and the stories and things must have been really inspiring.
It really was, yes, absolutely. Like, so growing up in the Welsh Marches on both sides, I was surrounded by so many Celtic hill forts that I would go and ascend on my weekends with my family. So one of the most famous ones that I grew up next to was the Wrekin, which is a very, very famous place here in Shropshire associated with giants. So one of the stories I grew up with was this giant called Gwendol Wrekin ap Shenkin ap Mynydd Mawr. Try and say that 10 times fast, it's an absolute challenge. But it goes to show that those stories and those mythologies echo throughout the landscape, and they very much transform the identity of the people because they are a place that we can feel connected to. And with the Wrekin as well, when I used to ascend to the top of that, you could see the River Severn flow through the landscape. And there was just a sacred call to just to take in the awe of the place. So when you ascend to the top of the Wrekin, it is very much a rural landscape. So you can see the Stiper Stones, you can see the Berwyn mountain range. When I used to cross over from the border going towards my dad's, you go across a place called Llanymynech, which is very much centered on the border. And even there, you have these stories of fairies entering holes. You have the giants as well. So I grew up with a giant story where he buried his wife within the within Llanymynech Hill itself. And currently, as I'm writing my second book, it's really interesting exploring the mythos and folklore because a lot of people see that folklore is nothing more than just these fairy tales that are used for entertainment, really, but they carry echoes of um, of our place in the world. They carry those ancient pieces of history that have been preserved through generations, through orality. And in my writings, when I look about giants specifically in my next book, they carry those echoes of ancient chieftains that were battling within the landscape of that territory disputes. So you can see that idea of borders being echoed throughout the landscape into the modern day. And it's one of the things I talk about in my book as well with Sabrina that as the rule of the Welsh Marches, I think it's really important for people to kind of suspend their belief in the idea of a border because, as I said before, it's nothing more than just an administrative fallacy that's used to contain for those who are in hierarchical positions, but it doesn't necessarily represent the folklore of the people. It doesn't represent the culture of the people. And it doesn't represent people like me either, who go over those liminal aspects and cross over in those borderland identities, which is something I really wanted to put across when talking about Sabrina as one of my personal encounters.
So, identifying as a Welsh Marches folk witch, you're really drawing on your cultural heritage, but also that which is in your blood and in your
Hmm.
bones and in your DNA, and from the landscape escape that and yeah, I do the same, and it's a really wonderful way to connect to the landscape as well. So I grew up obviously with the bore and the tides of the Severn, and we certainly couldn't get into the water and swim in it. So it's wonderful that you had the experience of being able to get in and swim in the river, and that must have been a delight.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, I find that so fascinating because no matter who I speak to, depending where they come within the Severn landscape, I always find there is a different energy connected to wherever she comes from. So if we're talking about Pumla Mawr, where she originates, going through the very first towns of Llanidloes and Drenewydd, there's almost this very young, um, boisterous energy that's almost full with life and vitality that you can feel it flowing. And as you migrate down through the river, especially through Shrewsbury and going down into Worcestershire, it almost matures. It feels like there is this all-encompassing parental feeling to the river. But I know I totally understand when it comes to the fear that is drummed into you when you come to the river. So I did have it a little bit growing up because in my folklore, which is a little bit weird, I was always taught to avoid going near the Severn because it was haunted. And that during
Mm.
certain liminal aspects of time, especially during dusk, you could see the spirits of the Severn walking around. If you were walking too far to the Severn, they would come and claim you. They'd come and drown you. Or specifically, if you go out on Sunday, the devil would pull you under. I don't know why the devil got attached to the river, but hey, that's Christianity dominating the culture for you. But with Pinot Vowed and going so close near to the source near enough, and then going into Shrewsbury, obviously I had Welsh family who were very much inspired by the folklore of that region. So they knew about, the Tylwyth Teg or the fairies, or they knew about certain spectral hounds that were haunting that landscape. And so they had a fear of going near places that had that liminal aspect, such as water, particularly with the River Severn. And it clicked with me when I was doing my research because when I looked at it and I saw that things like the Brenin Lloyd or the Grey King, which is kind of like an epithet for Gwyn ap Nudd, this otherworldly deity, or the psychopomp was traveling near the mountain landscapes such as Eryri or Cadair Idris or Pumlummon, that they have this otherworldly retinue of dogs would walk around, and my family would tell me that they go through these landscapes, these tracks, and they would come across these spectral hounds looking at them with these glowing red eyes. So I was drilled never to go out at night time near the river because these animals would be found inhabiting. But I sometimes do find myself going across to the tidal estuary because I used to visit my sister who lives in Cardiff, and I'd spend every 6 weeks holiday down there, and crossing over that beautiful bridge, especially in the dark, and just hearing the ferociousness of that wave, it was quite terrifying. So I feel like when you go to the tidal estuary, this is when we get this more elderly, this more less nurturing, but more how can I say recroaching belief that you do not want to mess with this water. It is sacred and it's beautiful, but it will have you reprimanded in an instant if you disrespect it in any shape or form. And hearing the crashing of that wave, it terrified me. It really did, hearing that in the dark. And I think, like you said, that's something that's drilled into a lot of people who are in the tidal estuary. I mean, if we look to like the 8th century with Nennius, or no, sorry, 9th century with Nennius, and he describes the tidal estuary as the Dair Havrin, the two kings of the Severn, where even the Romans feared it, they were scared of it. That, yeah, I think if you live down that area, I think you'll have a little bit of a different experience than people like me who grew up more in the north. But it still is drummed in, but not so much in that way that you'll have this massive surge of a tidal wave coming and completely wipe you out. But it's more like, oh, you'll drown, or the devil will pull you under, or you'll get spirited away by the fairies and now they're dogs.
I've said before that Sabrina is a constantly changing landscape, and therefore she's constantly interesting, and
Yeah.
being such a long river, there is so much folklore to be captured all along her banks, all up and down the country, and this is part of the reason why I do the podcast, is to try and record some of that, and so it's really lovely to hear your experience of growing up in that very different part, of the Severn. Yeah, and I love that story with Gwyn ap Nudd with the dogs, and that makes me think of the dog that they found at Lydney Park Temple, that
Oh,
was supposed to be dedicated to Nodens. And I'm not sure about all that. I've got my own theories, but, there is that interesting connection there. And of course, you go into all of that in the book.
absolutely. And I was reading about, like, I've spoken to quite a few people that work when it comes to Nodens and it comes to the Lydney Temple, and they're not quite sure as to whether it was a full-on dream dormitory, but it's fascinating when you see the dogs being included in there, because obviously, to people that don't know, Nodens was this Celtic deity that was almost a maritime deity, so it was very much attached to the Severn vicinity of the estuary. And obviously, the people believed that when people went there to go have their ailments cured, they were entering into this trance dream state where they would meet these dogs either in spiritual form or physical form to lick their wounds, and we find deposits of those sacred dogs. But it fascinated me so much with Gwyn ap Nudd because Nudd means mist. So Nodens went through this grammatical transformation in the Welsh language to become Nudd, which is mist, and his son Gwyn, the blessed son of mist. And then it became into Llydd, or Llydd Llaw Eraint, which is Llydd of the Silver Arm, which is another king that's found within the tales of the Mabinogion. And Llydd, it's really fascinating because that silver arm is cognate within Irish tales with Noava, the silver arm. And then you have Nodens with the idea of his arm, a bronze arm was found in his temple, I think. And then when you look to the Mabinogi, like the ancient manuscripts that contain some of the oldest written tales, you'll find in the first branch that Ternan Torith Lleiant, I think it is off the top of my head, battles this otherworldly arm that come across as if in the Severn bottom near Gwent and steals his foal. So, and then you translate his name, and it's like Lord of the Raging Bull that comes from the Prophonic Tiganonos. So all these different aspects down in that southern region relating to Nodens and Mist and the otherworldly dogs as well, which comes into the folklore of Gwyn ap Nudd as this otherworldly ruler of the retinue of the Cŵn Annwn, or the dogs of the otherworld. I find it fascinating. There's a little bit things I'm a little bit skeptical about, but the dog thing really did interest me a little bit, and I think there should be more to explore there, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's more coming, more interesting information coming out all the time.
Yes.
And we haven't even scratched the surface, Brett. We could talk all night, but we'll
Yeah.
have to come to a sort of an end.
Oh no. Oh, I was really enjoying myself.
Um, but I suppose, obviously, I'll post a link of your book for listeners to be able to buy a copy. I've really
Oh,
enjoyed
thank you.
it.
Thank you.
It's written with a real, intimate knowledge of the Severn. And we can really sense that through, your writing, and also, when you talk so openly about your connection with Sabrina, which is lovely. And I suppose, really, why do you think it's important, just to sort of bring it to a conclusion? Why do you think it's important that we Sabrina is talked about, known about, and written about, and venerated? Why is she important to you, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. So I think from a very individualistic perspective, Sabrina is really important for me to help others to educate, so that I can raise enchantment and raise awe and inspiration for our rivers, to draw people back to where those generational stories are held, that people can feel connected to the landscape. Because Sabrina, unlike many of the common pantheons that people tend to be drawn towards, is kind of overlooked and almost neglected. But on a more collective scale, I think it's really important, especially within the modern day age, where a lot of our rivers are deemed to be extremely unhealthy through mass pollution, degradation, as well as destruction from commodification and increased urbanization. That we have to take precedent of our rivers, especially those who are pagan witches, priests, anyone or priestesses. We have to take note of what's going on and to tell these stories to help have people be inspired and take action. Because a recent report reported that most of the rivers across England and Wales, they are at significant increase of dying. There's, the increase of urbanization. There's lack of money being put into the infrastructure from those in the capitalistic hierarchies who are pocketing all that money. And during the expansion of this, more and more of our river life is being destroyed. And it's so beautiful to see people take a stand and take action to use their voice and to protest, like especially with the River Wye going on as well, where you have these puppets of Sabrina and her sister traversing the streets and calling people to aid and coming to people to say, hey, look, this is what's going on, fight against what's going on. So I think it's really important to tell these tales and to utilize our magic, our inspiration, and our ancestors to help bring Sabrina back to the forefront and to show more respect and reciprocity with our rivers.
Yeah, and I think, the story of Sabrina is one that draws people in, and
Mm,
they can get to know her, and therefore they start to care about her, and that's really important, because so many rivers flow into her.
yes.
So she gets everything, she gets everything thrown at her, from the Wye to the Avon, to
Yeah.
all of those rivers. So if anything goes into them, they all flow into her.
Yeah.
And so it's about, if we can keep those clean, then that's gonna, the land will flourish.
Yes.
And if they become polluted, the land will die, and therefore we will die.
Absolutely. We're all
It's not
connected.
rocket science, is it?
That's it. That's it. Absolutely. And let's just put it this way, Sabrina, although she's beautiful and nourishing, she has that very vicious aspect to her that if we keep messing and recroaching on water's territory, she will flood and take action against us. And we see that time and time again, especially with climate change and all these different changes to the environment. We are having increased floods that are destroying the infrastructure that we've built as humans. And rightly so, because we are disrespecting the river. But I think that's one thing I like to really drill into people, because you see a lot of this greenwashing language being put across from the water companies, that they are doing all these wonderful things to invest, but they're not. Nothing's happening. They are taking advantage of the law and of the people, and it's us ultimately that pays the price for it. And a lot of us are. involved. I say it's not necessary to reprimand, but a lot of us are involved in capitalism because that's the society that we live in. So a tiny bit of us do have that blood on our hands, but not to the level that they have it. But they try and influence to think that, oh, it's all our fault, and so we have to tax us and raise our water levels up so that we have to pay that extra money to invest into the infrastructure. But I say to people, there are so many beautiful things that you can do to show not only as an offering and a veneration to Sabrina and other river deities, you don't necessarily have to go on these massive campaigns. Well, you should do really as much as you can. Take up the opportunity you can do. But there are so many lovely things that you can do at home, such as being conscious of how much water you're using, recycling, picking up rubbish and litter. One of the personal things I do in my craft, just quickly, is I am an avid crocheter. I love to crochet, and currently, because of the incentive of the increased poultry farm that's going on across the Severn banks, I'm crocheting these granny square chickens that I'm going to be selling to donate money to the Severn Trust. So there's so many lovely things that you can do that doesn't necessarily require you to go out and march if you haven't got the time or if you haven't got any access to it for whatever reason. But it's so important that we do take note because, like you said, we are all interconnected. We are all on this world and we all have equal access to it. And it's time to remove humans from the center of that and to be all encompassing. And if anything, Sabrina should be at the forefront of that because she's been here before us and she'll be here long after us. And we are beholden to her waters for our whole entire livelihood.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Brett, for giving us your time this evening. And
Oh, no, thank you.
yeah, no, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. And maybe come on again in the future.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you so
So
much for having me.
what's next for you? I think you're bringing out a new book next on folk magic.
Yes, so it's called The Magic of the Welsh Marches, Witchcraft and Enchantment from the Celtic Fringe. So in that book, I explore the Welsh Marches completely wider beyond the doorstep of Sabrina. So I talk about other deities that are prevalent in the landscape, folk magic, seasonal celebrations, folklore. I talk a lot about Owain Glyndwr and the tripart indenture, as well as his involvement in prophecy. I talk about divination. And one of the things I'm really, really invested in exploring is the idea of hiraeth, that internal, almost longing, that melancholy ache. And there are bardic compositions that have been written specifically for the Welsh landscape that talks about that and how there are hidden goddesses that are overlooked because a lot of people do focus on the Mabinogi and the Mabinogion wider, but there are other ones that are here that talk about the longing for home and the connection for home, whether we are born in Wales or outside of it, or whether we have an interest in the Celtic continuum. So that is my next book that I'm working on at the moment, currently.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Brett for joining me on the podcast this evening. You can follow him on social media on TikTok, Blue Sky, and Facebook, and his book is available on Amazon and through Moon Books Publishing.